Good morning and welcome to Lightcast LinkedIn Live this Friday morning. I'm senior economist Dr. Rachel Cederberg coming to you live from Boston, Massachusetts. And I'm going to be joined by my talented colleagues, senior economist Ron Hetrick and senior economist Rucha Vankudre. Welcome, Ron and Rucha. Let's talk about jobs today.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So this lovely Friday morning, we've got a lot to talk about. The first thing I thought we could talk about is just the top line numbers. So this report shows 180,000 jobs in July, which is a downward revision from the previous 2 months. So I'd love to hear your initial thoughts on that. Rucha, what are your initial thoughts on the report?
I think it's very much in line with what everyone was expecting. We were really expecting to see still having some jobs gained, right around that, somewhere around 200, I think is what most people were thinking. And that's what we're seeing, which means that the economy is still growing, but much more slowly than it has been previously. And I think that's just what we want. The other sort of top line number everyone looks at is the unemployment rate, which ticked down slightly to 3.5%. And I think that was also very expected. So in many ways, this is kind of a remarkably unremarkable report. Everything is sort of continuing on trend the way most people have expected. And I think that's a good thing for everyone right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Ron, what are your first thoughts that you want to talk about?
Yeah, like Rucha said, it's almost like a photocopy of last month. What's funny is you get kind of these divisions, things that have been developing, things that were really, really hot last year. So supply chain, which was really hot. Boy, it is not hot anymore. It's been cold. As the year's gone on, more losses, not necessarily huge losses in things like, transportation or trucking and things like that, but all the way through to retail. And then, an industry that's really been struggling this year, temporary staffing, really big loss there. But yet it's countered, we'll keep talking about some of these other industries. It's countered by the industries that have been actually doing pretty well lately. And we can go into more in depth in that. But I did like the predictability of this. It certainly makes this easier. But there are some things, kind of hidden in that data that we were bringing up last month that continue to flesh out again this month.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, just quickly to add, I don't think I've ever read the word unchanged so many times in a BLS report.
We'll have to check that, see if it's a record, and then call Guinness, right? Okay, so the next question, Rucha, is for you. We've now seen 5 straight months of increases in those not in the labor force. So they're not employed and they're not actually looking for a job. What should we be taking from this?
So I think what's really interesting there, and the first thing I want to note is while it's an increase, it's a small increase. But I think the thing that's most interesting about that is it's actually primarily being driven by men. We are not seeing that same increase in women. So this really is men, and it's actually young men. So if you look at the numbers for 16 to 19-year-olds, we're seeing it increase there. And then we're seeing it in the men 16 and over. So I think really what we're seeing is a very specific trend. Relating to this very specific segment of the population. And it's also interesting is if you think back to sort of early pandemic, it was women really initially leaving the labor force, right? And now this is sort of, I think, what we've seen before, but in some ways is maybe more problematic because at least, with women, there are large structural issues to solve, but we know what they are. Whereas with the young men, I think that's a group we've always sort of had a hard time trying to get back into the labor force. And so I think it's going to be a much stickier problem.
Got it. Ron, your thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things here that she mentioned that we really have to be careful on. And that, is we keep waiting for the teen labor force to grow. And yet we keep adding to the not in the labor force. This is a trend we've been seeing now. We've been speaking on it for the past couple of years. But this kind of disappearance of the teen labor force, not that we know that there's kind of a demographic thing that's about to occur, but the numbers still kind of support this. So what we're seeing is, as these kids hit these ages, they're just not working. And this is July. So you can understand, well, schools may be let out a little late. They weren't in the June report. So we certainly expect that maybe they'd show up in July, but they're not there. Another thing that I thought was interesting in this report was the over 65 category was a net negative. So when we look at these gains, you would think, oh, I get it. We're just accelerating boomer retirements. No, that's not true. We didn't see that in the data. So Rucha's point about it's coming from younger people, that's definitely not a trend that we want to see.
Absolutely. Something to keep an eye on in future months for sure. So, Rucha, what signals are you looking for in this report to suggest maybe in for a soft landing? What are you looking at here?
I think the two main things we discussed earlier, right, which is that we want unemployment to stay low, which it has been. I actually think it going up a little bit wouldn't be a terrible thing. So this is maybe slightly down, but on the other hand, you definitely don't want it to spike up by a huge amount, right? So in that sense, I think that's a good thing to keep an eye on. And then the other thing is, these jobs numbers that we're seeing, right? So what we want is jobs to continually be added, which is what we have, but we don't want it to be a huge number, right? Which would sort of accelerate things in the wrong direction again. And so I think the combination of this number being lower than what we've seen over the past 12 months on average, and the fact that the past 2 months were revised downward are all good signs.
Absolutely.
I wanted to add just that real quick to that. We've been watching the earnings numbers. Now, granted, we know that inflation has been stabilizing. So it's interesting now that when you see average hourly earnings changes, you kind of look at that a little bit, more than you probably have done in the past. And we had this gain this month. But what's interesting in that is that there were declines in things like retail trade and restaurants and things. Those were things that were really pushing the envelope, right? Last year, it was the crisis of not being able to find these workers for services industries. They were also competing with manufacturing and construction and everything. Now, those industries, manufacturing specifically, had a decent gain, and construction had a pretty good gain. So, we're seeing this kind of war that's occurring, but I think there's some industries like construction that are like, look, we can pass that on easy. We'll just increase housing costs. I mean, housing costs have not adjusted like people thought. But when it comes to the services industries, and it's harder to do that, it's interesting to see that they are no longer having, to go higher. And I think we've been looking at that almost as an indication that we could have a soft landing, because if these people can find their workers and they don't have to pass all of those costs on, those costs that you experience every day, then maybe we can increasingly get inflation under control.
And just wanting to jump onto something Ron just said about the industries that sort of still are seeing these gains. I think it's interesting, we saw in this report here that in general, I think, the gains were in line with what we've been seeing previously, right? But both healthcare and construction added more jobs. So they've been trending upwards over the past 6 months. And then when you look at the Lightcast job postings data and you look at where the largest wage increases are year over year, you actually see something similar, right? We're seeing large wage increases for people in construction and in healthcare. And so I think, we're seeing a lot of consistencies here where there are certain industries that are just really struggling to get people in the door. And as luckily, I guess, yeah, even with healthcare, right, to some extent, some of those costs can get passed on. And particularly with construction, right, with housing and all of those things, renovation costs, those can always keep going up. So in some ways, I think it's not surprising that we are seeing those industries continue to add jobs and have wage pressures.
Absolutely. So on that note, are we worried about a wage price spiral, or are we thinking it's okay? Ron, to you on that one?
It's interesting. I'm going to roll a related thing. When you use this question to bring in another thing that I wanted to talk about and tell you why I think we're not. So if we look at last month, we talked about the fact that the Hispanic population pretty much made up all of our labor force increase. If we look at this month, it was 70% of the labor force increase. If we look at year over year, this is the largest increase in Hispanics in our labor force, the third largest in history and the largest since 2012. I really do believe that we are bringing people in to fill certain roles, and the pay levels in those roles are lower. And there's also not going to be as much competition to send those wages particularly higher. So I think you are seeing things where we're addressing a lot of our labor force shortages by bringing in people from the outside to help fill those jobs. That keeps you from having this kind of spiraling wage price pressure. If you can get people that, on the cheap or can afford the workers that you have, you don't have to pass any cost forward. And I do believe if you watch over the past, several months, if you've seen these numbers increasing, it's been interesting to watch pricing keeps going down during this time. Yet our unemployment rate's 3.5%. That shouldn't happen, but it is. And I think it is because of who we're adding to the labor force, how we're filling those jobs and easing the price pressure in those categories.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Rucha, any thoughts on the matter that you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Ron said, if you look, last month, I think was the first month we actually had wage increases outpace inflation, right? So, I mean, we're barely at the precipice of this, I would say, in general. So I'm not too worried because I think, for so long, inflation has outpaced wages by a lot. And wages are increasing, but they're increasing slowly, right? This is not some crazy spike we've seen. And same thing with inflation. Nothing is really moving quickly, which for the economy is a good thing, right? Things are adjusting slowly in the directions that we want them to go, and that's a good thing.
Absolutely. So we've talked about a lot of larger trends here, but I'd like to take a minute to look at maybe some individual industries. Are there any that surprised you this month? Rucha, we'll start with you. Any industries we should be focusing on?
I don't actually have an answer for this, so I'm just going to throw it out. But the wholesale trade adding 18,000 jobs this month, last month, I found very surprising. As I said, most of the other places where we saw jobs added, places like construction, healthcare, financial activities, those were all had been adding jobs for the past couple of months, and so maybe they've added a few thousand more, right? And so that kind of it tracks. But wholesale trade we hadn't really been seeing much of, and now we had this big 18,000 gain, which is quite large for them. So I was surprised, but I don't have an answer for it.
That's fair. That's perfectly fair. It's still surprising. Absolutely. Ron, anything you want to add on this one?
It's not really, didn't see any surprises outside of, there was this odd gain in like personal services, like laundry. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
We went crazy doing laundry last month. That part felt a little bit odd to me, but I think for me, the gain in construction was it's nice to see. It was all in residential. Like if you look at this kind of non-residential side, that is actually going down, and that's kind of consistent. There's not a huge demand for commercial real estate right now, but you're seeing if construction's able to hire people and they're able to build homes. I mean, this is kind of the key to unlocking a future of maybe getting housing prices more in line. So I like to see that. I will tell you, I was a little shocked at the depth of the drop in temporary staffing and contingent staffing. 35,000 is a pretty big number, and they've been having some struggles this year. By far in the past year, not even close, have lost the most jobs of any industry. But that loss was, quite a punch in the face. So I think for people in that industry who are like, wow, when's the bottom? Well, you certainly hope maybe this is the summer of our discontent.
Got it. All right, let's head towards final thoughts. We've been chatting quite a while now. So, Rucha, what are your 3 big takeaways from this report?
Ooh, 3 is hard because I feel like this report was not that exciting, and that's a good thing. I feel like my big takeaway really is we are on track. Things are going well. I mean, the labor market has been remarkably resilient, right, to all of these hikes that we've been seeing. Unemployment is still so low. With the JOLTS report that came out earlier, job openings dropped a little, but really not by much. And so I think the strength of our labor market really is what is showing here, and that we can sort of get things back in line the way we want to without spiking unemployment, which is a great thing.
Absolutely. Ron, how about you? Big 3 takeaways, or more or less, whatever you would like.
Yeah. I mean, I think my takeaways, who knows if this will ultimately end up at 3, is I was going to be really surprised if we had a large payroll number. We just still don't have the labor force to do it. Let's never lose our perspective. I say it every month, 3.5% unemployment. These are record low levels. We're not doing much to help that. We have a lot of people still leaving the labor force. The ones that aren't leaving the labor force are the ones we're bringing in probably from other countries. We had another big gain in the Asian labor force, which includes things like the Philippines and India. So our labor force is being held afloat by bringing people in. And that's kind of, how we expected this to happen, but it's interesting to see it unfold. And it's also interesting for people out there kind of speculating, about growth in the industries that are hiring. Try to think of these kind of people and what kind of industries they typically do end up in. And it does kind of help you to understand, this is addressing critical problems in our country. I think overall, I like this report. Once again, no big surprises. And I don't know if we really want surprises.
Right. Boring might be a good thing here. Well, thank you so much, Ron and Rucha, for joining me this morning. It has been a pleasure talking with you. For more information, visit our website at lightcast.io, and we'll see you again next month.